How do you manage water retention or edema on TRT?
Right. Yeah. So this is an interesting one, and people worry about it a lot, don't they? You see that a lot in posts in your group on Facebook, and I think that the key thing we need to think about is not sort of rushing straight in to manage it, but asking ourselves the question, why is it happening? So it's very commonly seen when we first commence TRT, and I think a lot of people worry about estradiol being the culprit. And it's more than often not the case. So when we think about how our bodies respond to exogenous testosterone use, we see that impact at the very beginning of treatment mostly. And it does tend to be transitory and settle, but it's more often than not, I think it's not to do with estradiol per se. It's more to do with our sort of sodium regulation hormones. So with the main ones being renin and aldosterone, because you do see an upregulation in aldosterone when you first commence TRT, and that's because if I could work out how to share screens with you, I could show you them in the steroidogenesis cascade diagram that I've got. But essentially, you can all go and Google that. But you've got multiple arms of cross conversion when you're thinking about steroidogenesis. So it's not just about our sex hormones, our male androgen hormones, and estradiol and progesterone and things like that, and pregnenolone and allopregnenolone. You've got cross conversion arms, and one of those is the mineralocorticoid arm. Now that's what regulates our fluid. And the main one being aldosterone, with obviously renin coming into play as well, because our kidneys are what control all of our fluid regulation in the body, and that in turn controls our blood pressure. So when you first start TRT, you do see a bit of an increase in aldosterone, and that will lead to a little bit of water retention. You'll see people most commonly posting about it either sort of peripherally, so ankles, feet, things like that, and also sort of around the face. They get that puffy sort of red face look. Now, as I said, it does tend to settle by itself. So I think in terms of management, I don't rush in. I tend to reassure. So clinically, I'll say this is expected. And the main thing being, we need to think about whether this is clinically impacting people. So by that, I mean, obviously, you see it. It's a bit unsightly. You don't like the look of it as a patient. But the reassurance that it is temporary, tends to put most guys' minds at rest. But the clinical thing we need to think about is it impacting our blood pressure? Like, so if you've got, for example, guys with a history of congestive heart failure, or they've got a history of anabolic steroid use, and they already have some sort of cardiac remodeling or left ventricular hypertrophy, then yeah, you need to probably take those case by case basis and think to yourself, this deserves a little bit more exploration. So I think in terms of management, you don't need to rush in, and I certainly am not a big fan of using any kind of antidiuretic medication, because again, we're just sort of treating a symptom rather than looking at a cause, and the cause is often very temporary. Now, like thinking about if you were to, like, so a lot of people will hammer the estradiol thing when they and say, no, it's definitely this because the physiological mechanism of estradiol, which I might add is actually, in terms of our data, is mostly derived from female studies, which, when you think about their levels of estradiol, they are in no way comparable to even some of the highest levels you see of guys on TRT. But from a physiological perspective, estradiol, the reason people worry is because it does alter the set point for osmoregulation of arginine vasopressin, which can increase your plasma volume, which then makes people worry about increased blood pressure. Now, that hormone, or we'll call it AVP because it's a bit of a mouthful, is actually our primary hormone that's involved in the regulation of renal free water. But as I've mentioned already, it does also affect our sodium regulation hormones like aldosterone and renin. Now, interestingly, when you look at the data for women, and we need to remember these are very high levels of estradiol in these women, the clinical effects or alterations in their physiology are seen to be very minimal. So jumping on this bandwagon and saying that estradiol is causing this fluid retention and this is something that we must worry about and we need to hammer that number down because you've seen one clinical symptom of, say, slightly puffy ankles or a bit of a puffy face in the first few months on TRT doesn't make logical sense to me. And interestingly, even in these studies on women, it doesn't actually increase the risk of deleterious cardiovascular events, having these high levels that do cause these clinical alterations like peripheral edema and sort of some puffiness of the face. So if it's not impacting your blood pressure as a male patient and the number is, in no way comparable to these massive levels you see in women, then I don't think if comorbidities aside, so congestive heart failure and other cardiac things, then yeah, you need to take a bit of a measured approach working with their teams, because they'll be under people that look after that side of things anyway. Then you don't need to worry too much. But if you were really wanting to look at doing something, if that reassurance for your patient hasn't had as big an impact as you would have liked, then you can think about other things like vitamin B6 supplementation, magnesium. So sort of, in the higher dosing regimens, more than you need to see anybody sort of recommending, can temporarily, you wouldn't want to keep them on this long term, have an impact on reducing this sort of fluid retention. So things like magnesium, you'd be looking at sort of what they've studied in the literature is sort of 600 milligrams plus, things like that. And then the obvious ones, like keep hydrated, keep your electrolyte balance going, flush those kidneys through, because don't over consume protein, because that's a big one that we do. We're all guilty of doing that. Most guys that are on TRT do like to keep physically active and fit and do quite a bit of resistance training. Now that increases your creatinine, and you want to make sure that your kidney clearance times, which can be studied via things like EGFR, estimated glomerular filtration rate, or cystatin C is a bit more accurate, is actually allowing you to clear that creatinine adequately. Because what you don't want over time, if you're over consuming protein and not hydrating and on TRT, is to give yourself a slow burn chronic kidney injury, which can occur. But those are sort of in extreme circumstances. You've got to be eating sort of 200 to 300 milligrams of protein, 200 to 300 grams of protein a day to be doing that kind of stuff. And that's IFBB style stuff. Like, that's not, your average guy's not going to be doing that. So I think, to summarize, it's not something that we need to jump on and actively manage. But if you did want to do that, then start with the basics. So look at keeping well hydrated, perhaps supplement with vitamin B6 and magnesium high dosage.
If you wish to support the channel, consider becoming a channel member. And check out the links in the description of all the things I'm associated with. My ebook on compounded testosterone cream, multiple workout programs, Mizumi skincare, online pharmacy NP labs, and a list of Amazon links to the supplements we recommend.